One more night. That's all I'm asking." Her voice trembled like the desert wind before a storm, soft, desperate, and full of something he'd spent his whole life running from under the burning western sky. A man who'd sworn never to love again found himself standing at the edge of a choice that could destroy them both. The dust, the silence, the way her eyes held him. It all felt heavier than the miles behind him. One night to stay. One night to forget the lies, the law, and the blood on his hands. But in the frontier, every promise comes with a price. And sometimes love is the most dangerous bargain of all. The desert sun had already begun its slow descent when Jacob Stone opened his eyes to find himself surrounded by warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons aimed at his chest. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. The last thing he recalled was the crack of something hard against his skull, the taste of blood, and then nothing but blackness. Jacob Stone was a man who'd learned to trust the silence of the open range. For 3 years, he'd ridden alone through territories where most men traveled in groups, carrying nothing but his bedroll, his rifle, and a reputation for keeping his word. He wasn't running from anything. He simply preferred the company of stars to the company of liars. The frontier had a way of showing you who people really were, and Jacob had seen enough to know that solitude was often safer than society. But now that solitude had led him here, to this moment, bound at the wrists with rawhide rope so tight it cut into his skin, kneeling in the dust before a semicircle of Apache warriors whose eyes held nothing but anger and suspicion. Behind them, the rest of the tribe had gathered. Women clutching children, elders standing with crossed arms, all watching him like he was something dangerous that had crawled into their camp uninvited. The chief stepped forward. His name was Maka, a man whose presence commanded respect without him having to raise his voice. His face was weathered like ancient stone, marked by decades of protecting his people through treaties that were broken as often as they were made. He wore a ceremonial vest decorated with beadwork that told stories Jacob couldn't read, and his long grey hair was tied back with leather cord. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made too many hard decisions. 3 rifles were missing. Not just any rifles, but sacred ones. Weapons that had been given to the tribe through treaty negotiations, guaranteed protection that was supposed to last as long as the mountains stood. These rifles were kept in a protected storage area, guarded and honored, symbols of promises made by men in distant offices who wrote words on paper and called it law. And now they were gone. Jacob tried to explain. His voice was hoarse, his head still throbbing from whatever had struck him down. He told them he'd been riding through the canyon 2 miles south when someone ambushed him from the rocks above. He never saw their face, never heard them approach. Just the sudden explosion of pain and then waking up here, near their camp, with no memory of how he'd been moved or why. He was a victim in this, not a thief. He had no reason to steal from them, no reason to risk his life for 3 rifles when he already had his own. But evidence is a cruel master when it's been planted by clever hands. One of the warriors held up a piece of paper, a receipt with Jacob's name scrawled across it in ink, a transaction record allegedly showing he'd agreed to sell 3 rifles to a mining outfit in the territory. The paper looked official enough, stamped and dated. Jacob had never seen it before in his life, but there it was, damning him with every word. And then there was the witness, Royce Callahan, a settler who'd arrived in the territory 6 months prior, claiming to be a land surveyor working for development companies back east. He stood at the edge of the gathering now, his hat pulled low, his expression carefully arranged into something that looked like concern. He spoke with the smooth confidence of a man who'd told the same lie so many times. He'd started believing it himself, Royce told the council. He'd seen Jacob near the storage area 3 nights ago, seen him acting suspicious, seen him looking around like a man planning something he shouldn't. Of course, Royce claimed he hadn't thought much of it at the time, hadn't wanted to make accusations without proof. But now that the rifles were missing and Jacob had been found unconscious nearby, well, It all seemed to fit together, didn't it? The tribal council listened. Some of them had already made up their minds. The evidence was there. The witness was credible. And Jacob was just another wandering cowboy with no ties and no one to vouch for him. In a world where trust was currency, he was bankrupt. The youngest warriors called for immediate punishment. The elders spoke in their language, debating in tones that ranged from anger to resignation. This wasn't the first time someone had stolen from them. It wouldn't be the last, but these rifles, these sacred rifles, this was a violation that cut deeper than theft. Jacob felt the weight of it settling over him like a shroud. He'd faced death before. Rattlesnakes and rock slides, outlaws and storms that turned the sky black as midnight. But this was different. This was injustice wearing the mask of justice. This was being condemned for crimes committed by someone else's hands. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was knowing that the real thief was standing right there among them, watching with hidden satisfaction as the trap closed around Jacob's throat. Maka raised his hand, and the arguing stopped. The chief's face was unreadable as he looked down at Jacob. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in those dark eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or maybe just weariness. But then it was gone, replaced by the hard certainty of a leader who had to make decisions for the good of his people, even when those decisions felt like swallowing broken glass. The judgment was coming. Jacob could feel it in the air, heavy as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. His fate was being decided by evidence he couldn't disprove and testimony he couldn't contradict. The desert stretched out around them in all directions, vast and indifferent, and Jacob Stone understood that he might never see another sunrise. Not because he was guilty, but because guilt and innocence sometimes mattered less than appearances. And the appearance of his guilt was too perfect to question. Royce Callahan watched from the shadows, his face carefully neutral. But inside, the satisfaction was spreading like poison through his veins. Everything was going according to plan. The tribe would execute Jacob or banish him, either way removing him as a witness. The missing rifles would be blamed on Jacob, and the tribe's anger would fester. And then the real plan could begin. The settlers would hear about the theft. They'd hear about the Apaches' harsh punishment. Tensions would rise. Fear would spread. And frightened people did predictable things. They called for military intervention. They demanded protection. They signed petitions asking the territorial government to remove the tribes and open the land for proper civilization. And Royce had the forged land contracts already prepared. Documents that would transfer thousands of acres to mining companies who'd paid him handsomely for his services. All he needed was the chaos. All he needed was the war. And it was about to begin, with Jacob Stone's blood watering the seeds of conflict Royce had so carefully planted. Among the gathered crowd stood someone whose heart was breaking for reasons she couldn't yet speak aloud. Her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in the language of her ancestors. And she was Maka's only daughter, 23 years old, trained in the healing arts by her grandmother, and burdened with the terrible weight of knowing the truth while watching lies take root in fertile soil. Ayana had always been different. Even as a child, she'd asked questions that made the elders uncomfortable. Why did the treaties keep changing? Why did the settlers' promises sound like honey but taste like ash? Why did her people have to prove their humanity to men who'd never bothered to prove theirs? Her father loved her fiercely but worried about her. Worried that her questioning nature would bring her pain in a world that preferred women to be silent and compliant. But Ayana had never learned compliance. She'd learned observation instead. She'd learned to watch and listen and notice the things others missed. The way a man's hands trembled when he lied. The way someone's eyes shifted when they were hiding something. The way truth left marks that couldn't be erased. No matter how much dust you kicked over them. 3 nights ago, she'd been walking back from gathering herbs in the canyon when she'd seen something that made her blood run cold. Royce Callahan, the settler everyone thought was harmless. The man who smiled and nodded and pretended to respect their ways. She'd seen him at the storage area where the sacred rifles were kept. At first, she'd thought maybe he'd gotten lost. Maybe he was just passing through on his way somewhere else, but then she'd watched him look around, checking to make sure he was alone, before pulling tools from his satchel and working at the lock on the storage structure. The moon had been bright enough for her to see everything. The way he'd opened the door, the way he'd carefully removed 3 rifles and wrapped them in canvas, the way he'd then pulled something from his pocket, a piece of paper, and left it inside the storage area before closing the door and disappearing into the darkness. Ayanna had stood frozen behind the rocks, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he'd hear it. She'd wanted to cry out, to raise the alarm, to stop him in that moment. But fear had held her tongue, fear and the knowledge that accusing a white settler without witnesses could bring consequences down on her entire family. So she'd stayed hidden, stayed silent, and hated herself for it with every breath she took. The next morning, she'd heard about a cowboy found unconscious near the camp's edge. She'd helped treat his head wound, noting the way it had bled and swollen, understanding that this man had been struck down by someone who meant to kill him, or at least remove him from consciousness for long enough to complete their plan. And when the rifles were discovered missing later that day, when Royce Callahan had stepped forward with his lies and his convenient testimony, Ayanna had understood the full scope of what she'd witnessed. This wasn't just theft. This was framing. This was manipulation. This was a carefully constructed trap designed to destroy an innocent man and, she suspected, something even larger than that. But who would believe her? A woman speaking against a man, an Apache daughter contradicting a white witness. And not just any white witness, but one who'd spent months building relationships with traders and settlers throughout the territory. Royce Callahan had credibility that she could never match, so she'd stayed silent through the first day, silent through the second, silent as the council debated and the evidence mounted, and Jacob Stone's chances of survival grew thinner with each passing hour. She'd watched Royce carefully, looking for any crack in his facade, any moment where his mask might slip. But he was good, too good. He played the role of concerned citizen perfectly, expressing regret that circumstances had led to this, hoping the tribe would find justice, all while subtly pushing them toward the harshest possible punishment. Ayanna's mother had died when she was 12, a fever that the white doctors said they could have cured if the tribe had been willing to move to the reservation where proper medical care was available. Her father had held his wife's hand as she slipped away, and Ayanna had seen something break inside him that day. He'd become harder after that, more suspicious of outsiders, more willing to believe the worst because he'd lived through too many betrayals to maintain the luxury of optimism. And now that hardness was working against truth. Mika looked at the evidence against Jacob Stone and saw confirmation of every fear he'd ever held. Another white man, another theft, another violation of sacred trust. The fact that this particular white man was innocent didn't change the pattern, and patterns were what people used to navigate a dangerous world. But Ayanna knew something her father didn't. She knew that patterns could be exploited by clever predators who understood how to make their lies fit into expected shapes. Royce Callahan had counted on the tribe's anger and suspicion. He'd counted on them seeing what they expected to see. He'd counted on no one questioning the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. The judgment was approaching. Ayanna could feel time running out like sand through broken glass. Her father would make his decision soon. The council would support him, as they always did, and Jacob Stone would die, or be driven into the desert to die slowly under the merciless sun. Either way, the real criminal would go free, would continue with whatever larger plan he'd set in motion, would use this incident as kindling for fires that would consume far more than one man's life. She thought about her grandmother's words. The old woman had lived through massacres and forced marches, through treaties made and treaties broken, through decades of watching her people's land shrink while their suffering expanded. And she'd told Ayanna something that had seemed like simple wisdom at the time, but now felt like prophecy. The most dangerous moment is not when you know the truth, It's when you must decide whether to speak it, because speaking truth had consequences. Speaking truth could make you a target. Speaking truth could divide families and destroy relationships and mark you as someone who didn't know their place. Especially for a woman, especially for an Apache woman challenging a white man's word in front of her entire tribe. Ayanna looked at Jacob Stone kneeling in the dust. His face was bruised and exhausted, but his eyes held something she recognized. Not guilt, not fear of deserved punishment, but the desperate frustration of someone watching injustice unfold while being powerless to stop it. She'd felt that same frustration 3 nights ago when she'd hidden behind the rocks instead of crying out, and suddenly she understood that silence was its own kind of violence, that watching evil triumph because speaking up felt too dangerous was just another way of participating in that evil. That her grandmother's wisdom wasn't about finding the perfect moment to speak. It was about understanding that there were moments when silence became complicity. The council was reaching consensus. She could see it in their faces, see it in the way they nodded at Royce's carefully constructed lies, see it in the way her father's jaw tightened as he prepared to deliver the verdict that would end an innocent man's life and open the door to whatever chaos Royce had planned. This was the moment, this razor's edge between justice and injustice, between truth and the comfortable lies that people told themselves to avoid uncomfortable conflicts. Ayanna's hands were shaking. Her mouth was dry. Every instinct of self-preservation was screaming at her to stay quiet, to protect herself, to let someone else be the hero. But heroes weren't born in moments of courage. They were born in moments of choice. The choice to act when action was terrifying. The choice to speak when silence was safer. The choice to stand when kneeling was easier. She stepped forward, and in that single step everything changed. The council fell silent as Ayanna moved through the crowd. Every eye turned toward her. Her father's expression shifted from determination to confusion, then to something that might have been dread. He knew his daughter, knew that fire in her eyes, knew that when she made that particular face, the one that looked like her mother, she was about to do something that couldn't be undone. Ayanna, Maka said, his voice carrying a warning. This is council business. Return to the others. His words were formal, the tone of a chief speaking to a tribe member rather than a father speaking to his daughter. It was a wall he was trying to build between them, a wall that said, do not do this. Do not make me choose between you and my duty. But Ayanna had already made her choice. She stood before the council, before the gathered tribe, before Royce Callahan, whose face had gone very still and very watchful. She could feel her heart trying to escape her chest, could feel the trembling in her legs that she prayed no one else could see, could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. All the women who'd been forced into silence, all the truths that had died unspoken because speaking them was too dangerous. I have something to say, she announced, and her voice carried across the desert air with surprising strength. Something this council needs to hear before judgment is passed. The elders exchanged glances. Women didn't typically speak in council meetings, especially not during deliberations about serious crimes. But they didn't immediately silence her either, partly because she was the chief's daughter and deserved some level of respect. Partly because there was something in her bearing that demanded attention. She wasn't asking for permission. She was claiming her right to speak. Royce Callahan's eyes narrowed. Just slightly, just enough for someone watching carefully to notice. He was calculating now, trying to figure out what she might know, trying to determine if she was a threat to his carefully constructed narrative. His hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. Too many witnesses. Too much attention. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it hidden behind that mask of concern. 3 nights ago, Ayanna began, I was returning from the canyon where the healing herbs grow. I was alone. It was late, but the moon was bright enough to see clearly. I saw someone at the storage structure where the sacred rifles are kept. The council members leaned forward. Her father's face had gone very pale. He knew what was coming now. knew that his daughter was about to step into waters that could drown them both. I saw a man working at the lock. I saw him open the structure. I saw him remove 3 rifles and wrap them carefully in canvas cloth. I saw him place something, a piece of paper, inside before closing the door and leaving. She paused, letting the words settle like stones, dropped into still water. I saw everything. Royce stood up straighter, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with what sounded like genuine sympathy. "Miss, I understand you want to help this man. Sometimes our hearts lead us to see things that support what we wish were true. But testimony given in darkness from a distance, that's not the same as clear evidence." He gestured toward the receipt, toward Jacob Stone. "We have facts here, documents, a man found at the scene." But Ayanna wasn't finished. She turned to face Royce directly, and when their eyes met, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the moment when a predator realizes its prey has seen through the disguise. The moment when a liar understands that someone knows the truth beneath the performance. She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted to let her through, sensing that something significant was happening, even if they didn't fully understand what. She stopped 3 feet from Royce Callahan, close enough that he couldn't avoid her gaze, far enough that he couldn't easily intimidate her with his physical presence. And then Ayanna spoke 4 words. Just 4, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty, the weight of witnessed truth, the weight of a moment that would pivot the entire direction of events like a river changing course. "I saw you do it." The words fell into the gathering like lightning striking dry grass. Simple, direct, undeniable. Not "I saw someone" or "I think I saw." No hedging, no uncertainty. "I saw you do it." 4 words that shattered the carefully constructed narrative like a hammer through glass. Royce's face underwent a transformation. For just a second, maybe 2, the mask slipped completely. The concern vanished. The sympathy evaporated. What replaced it was cold and calculating and dangerous. It was the face of a man who'd been caught and was now deciding how much damage control was possible. But then he caught himself, and the mask slammed back into place. That's absurd," he said, and he even managed a confused laugh. "Chief Maka, your daughter is mistaken. I was nowhere near that storage area. I've been helping survey land near the settlement. I have witnesses who can confirm my whereabouts. But the damage was done. The doubt had been planted. And doubt was a powerful thing once it took root. The council members were looking at Royce differently now, looking at the evidence differently, looking at everything differently because one voice had spoken truth with absolute conviction. Siana pressed her advantage. Her fear was still there, trembling beneath her skin like a trapped bird. But she'd crossed the threshold now. There was no going back, only forward. "I know what I saw. I was close enough to recognize your face in the moonlight, close enough to see the tools you used, close enough to watch you check that paper before you placed it inside the structure." She turned to address the council. "He framed Jacob Stone, the receipt with this man's name. Royce must have forged it or stolen it. The unconscious man found near our camp. Royce attacked him and left him there. Everything was designed to make you believe a lie." Jacob Stone was staring at her with an expression that mixed hope and disbelief. He'd resigned himself to death, and now this stranger, this woman he'd never met, was risking everything to tell his truth. Maka's voice was quiet but firm. "Ayanna, do you swear this on your mother's memory? Do you swear this with full understanding of what false testimony means?" This was the test. The moment where she could still retreat, could claim confusion or uncertainty, could save herself from the consequences of accusing a white settler. Her father was giving her an out, one last chance to step back from the edge, and she loved him for it even as she rejected it. "I swear it on her memory," Ayanna said, and her voice didn't waver. "I swear it on everything I hold sacred. I swear it on the truth that should matter more than comfort or politics or fear." Royce Callahan stole those rifles. Royce Callahan framed Jacob Stone, and whatever his reasons, they're bigger than simple theft. This is about something more. Something worse. The tribal council erupted into discussion. Some demanded to know why she'd waited to speak. Others wanted to hear more details. The younger warriors looked ready to seize Royce immediately, while the elders counseled caution. But the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. The neat narrative had been disrupted. The convenient explanation had been challenged. And once doubt entered, it was impossible to seal it back out. Royce could feel control slipping through his fingers like water. He'd spent months setting this up. Months building trust and planting seeds and positioning pieces on the board. And now this girl, this woman, was unraveling everything with her testimony. He needed to regain the initiative, needed to cast doubt on her credibility. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should consider why the chief's daughter would make such claims. Maybe she has sympathies for this drifter. Maybe she's been convinced by his stories. Or maybe, he paused, letting insinuation do its work. Maybe there's some other relationship between them that would motivate her to lie for him. It was a low blow. An attempt to shame Ayana by suggesting improper conduct, a tactic as old as false accusation itself. When you can't attack the message, attack the messenger. Specifically, attack her character, attack her virtue. Make people question her motives so they stop listening to her words. But Makar stepped forward before Ayana could respond. His face was like carved stone, but his eyes were burning with something that made even Royce take a step backward. You will not, the chief said, each word deliberate and sharp as an arrow point, speak about my daughter that way. Question her testimony if you must, but do not question her honor. That path leads nowhere you want to go. The temperature in the gathering had changed. What had been a trial of Jacob Stone was becoming something else entirely. A confrontation between truth and lies, between justice and convenience, between a young woman's courage and a manipulator's carefully constructed facade. And everyone present could sense it, could feel the way the very AIR seemed to vibrate with importance. Because this moment, this convergence of courage and consequence, this was bigger than one framed cowboy or 3 stolen rifles. This was about whether truth could still matter in a world built on broken promises. Whether one voice, speaking clearly, could overcome institutional inertia and expected narratives. Whether justice was something you fought for or something you hoped would accidentally happen while you stayed safe and silent. 4 words. I saw you do it. Such a simple sentence. But in it was contained everything that separated civilization from chaos. The willingness to speak truth despite cost. The refusal to let evil hide behind plausible lies. The understanding that silence wasn't neutrality. It was choosing the side of whoever was willing to speak loudest. And Ayana had chosen to speak. The council demanded details. Not to discredit Ayana, though some surely hoped to find inconsistencies, but because details were how truth separated itself from invention. Liars often struggled with specifics. They dealt in generalizations and suggestions. But truth came with textures and colors and small observations that couldn't be fabricated on the spot. So Ayana described everything. The way Royce had approached the storage structure from the Eastern Trail, moving quickly but not running. The leather satchel he'd carried, dark brown with a brass clasp that caught the moonlight. The tool he'd used on the lock, something thin and metal that he'd worked carefully until the mechanism gave way. She described the way he'd paused after opening the door, listening to make sure no one had heard before slipping inside. She described the rifles, how he'd removed them one at a time, handling them with a reverence that had seemed odd for a thief. He hadn't been rough or hurried. He'd been careful, like someone who understood their value and didn't want to damage them. He'd wrapped each one individually in canvas cloth, the kind traders used for protecting goods during transport. And then he'd pulled that piece of paper from his vest pocket and placed it deliberately on the shelf where the rifles had been. He wanted it to be found, Ayana explained. That paper, the receipt with Jacob Stone's name. He positioned it where it would be visible immediately when someone opened the storage. He wanted to make sure the connection was obvious. The council members looked at the receipt again, looked at it with new eyes, and now they could see what they'd missed before. The ink was fresh, too fresh for a document that was supposedly weeks old. The paper wasn't creased or worn from being carried. It looked like something that had been written recently and placed carefully to create a specific impression. Evidence manufactured rather than discovered, one of the elders asked about the timeline. If Ayana had seen Royce steal the rifles 3 nights ago, why had they only been reported missing yesterday? Royce jumped on this question, seeing an opportunity to cast doubt. Yes, he said quickly. If I'd stolen them 3 nights ago, someone would have noticed sooner. The storage is checked regularly. But Marker shook his head slowly. It's checked every 4 days, he said quietly. That's our routine. We're a small tribe with many responsibilities. We trust the lock and the sacred nature of what's stored there. 3 nights ago would have been, he calculated, exactly halfway between inspections. Someone who'd been watching us, learning our patterns, would have known when to strike for maximum time before discovery. The implications settled over the gathering like a cold wind. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was planned, researched. Someone had spent time observing the tribe's routines, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting for the right moment. And that level of premeditation suggested motives beyond simple theft. Jacob Stone finally found his voice. It came out rough and strained. Check his satchel, he said. If he used it 3 nights ago for the rifles, maybe there's still evidence. Canvas fibers, oil from the gunmetal, something. Royce's hand moved unconsciously to protect the leather bag at his side, then stopped. The gesture was small but telling. Marker noticed. So did several others. You would object to showing us your bag? Lewis, the chief asked, his tone carefully neutral. If you have nothing to hide, surely you wouldn't mind proving my daughter wrong. It was a trap disguised as reasonableness. Refuse and guilt seemed obvious. Comply and risk whatever evidence might be found. Royce's mind was racing, trying to calculate odds and consequences. He'd cleaned the bag, or thought he had. But had he been thorough enough? Had he checked every seam and corner? 3 nights of time for any residue to settle into crevices he'd missed. Of course I don't object, Royce said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I have nothing to hide, but I do question whether this is appropriate. Are we really going to let one girl's testimony overturn clear evidence? Are we going to search an innocent man's belongings based on accusations made under, he paused significantly, possibly questionable emotional circumstances? He was trying to regain control of the narrative, trying to make the investigation seem like an overreaction, trying to cast doubt on Ayana's stability while appearing reasonable himself. It was a skilled manipulation, the kind that worked on people who wanted easy answers and didn't want to confront uncomfortable possibilities. But Marka was done with easy answers. Years of broken treaties and empty promises had taught him that comfortable lies were more dangerous than uncomfortable truths. Give me the bag, he said simply. Not a request, a command. For a moment, just a heartbeat. Royce considered refusing, considered running, considered reaching for the knife at his belt and trying to fight his way out. The calculations flickered across his face faster than conscious thought. But there were too many warriors, too many weapons, too much distance to cover before he'd be brought down. So he handed over the satchel with a casual shrug that couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. Maka opened it carefully. Inside were the expected items: surveying tools, a compass, some dried meat wrapped in paper, a canteen. Nothing obviously incriminating. Royce's expression relaxed slightly. Maybe he'd gotten away with it. Maybe there wasn't enough evidence after all. But Maka was thorough. He removed each item, examining it carefully. He ran his fingers along the inside seams of the bag. He checked the pockets and flaps, and in the very bottom, wedged into a corner where the leather joined, he found a small tuft of canvas fiber, cream-colored, the same shade as the cloth used for wrapping trade goods. It wasn't much, just a few threads, but context gave them meaning. Ayana's testimony gave them meaning. The timeline gave them meaning. Alone, they were nothing. Together with everything else, They were a crack in the facade, a small piece of physical evidence that corroborated her story. Canvas fibre, Maka said quietly, holding it up to catch the light, like the cloth used for wrapping rifles during transport. He looked at Royce. Can you explain why this would be in your bag? Royce barely hesitated. I transport surveying equipment. Sometimes it's wrapped in canvas. This could be from anything. His voice was steady, but there was a brittleness to it now, a sense that he was defending against an enemy he hadn't expected and wasn't fully prepared for. "Search him," one of the younger warriors demanded. "Search his clothes, his horse, everything. If he stole the rifles, they have to be somewhere. He couldn't have sold them yet. There hasn't been time." But Ayana shook her head. "The rifles are gone. He had 3 nights to move them. They're probably hidden miles from here or already delivered to whoever hired him." She was thinking now, following the logic of what she'd witnessed. This wasn't about the rifles themselves. The theft was just the beginning, just the spark. He needed them gone and needed someone to blame for it. But why? What does he gain from framing Jacob Stone and making our tribe look like victims? Was the right question. The question that opened doors to larger understanding. Maka's expression changed as he followed that thread of thought. "Conflict," he said slowly. "If a white man was executed or punished by our tribe, even if he was guilty, it would give the settlers and the territorial government an excuse to intervene, to demand our removal for the safety of white citizens. They've been looking for justification, any justification. To break the treaty and take our land." The pieces were falling into place. Not just a frame job, not just a theft, but a provocation, an engineered incident designed to create the appearance of Apache aggression. The kind of incident that newspapers love to print. The kind that made politicians demand action. The kind that turned public opinion against treaty obligations and made forced removal seem like necessary protection rather than theft. One of the elders spoke up, his voice heavy with bitter experience. "This has happened before. Different methods, same goal. They create situations where we look dangerous or ungrateful or unable to coexist peacefully. Then they use those situations to justify taking what they wanted all along. Our land, our resources, our future." Jacob Stone was putting it together too. "And I was perfect for the role," he said quietly. "A drifter with no family, no one to ask questions if I disappeared. No one to investigate if my body turned up in the desert with Apache arrows in it. My death would be a story, a tragedy, a reason for retaliation." He looked at Royce with something beyond anger, understanding. "You weren't just framing me. You were trying to start a war." Royce's mask was cracking. The genial concern was giving way to cold assessment. He was still calculating, still looking for exits. His hand drifted toward his belt again. And this time, several warriors noticed and moved to flank him. He was surrounded now, physically cornered. But cornered predators were the most dangerous kind. "Check his papers," Ayana said suddenly. "Men like this, they don't work alone. They work for someone, for something. There will be documents, letters, contracts, something that shows who hired him and why." Maka nodded to 2 warriors who moved to search Royce more thoroughly despite his protests. They found a leather document case hidden inside his vest, pressed flat against his body where it wouldn't create an obvious bulge. Inside were papers that told a story more damning than any testimony could provide. Land contracts. Dozens of them. Documents transferring thousands of acres to mining companies and settlement corporations. All bearing the territorial seal. All looking official and legitimate, except for one small problem. The signatures at the bottom weren't from tribal representatives. They were forgeries. Careful, skilled forgeries. But forgeries nonetheless. "These contracts," Maka said, his voice dangerously quiet as he read through them, "claim to sell our sacred grounds, our water sources, our burial sites. They claim we agreed to leave, to relocate to reservation land hundreds of miles north. In exchange for payment we never requested and would never accept." He looked up at Royce. "How much were you paid to arrange this?" How much is our home worth to the men who hired you? Royce said nothing. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes calculating distances and odds that were growing worse by the second. The evidence was overwhelming now. The forgeries, the frame job, the manufactured conflict. All of it exposed because one woman had found the courage to speak 4 words that shattered his carefully constructed lies. The tribe understood now, understood the full scope of what had almost happened. If Ayanna had stayed silent, if Jacob Stone had been executed or driven out, if the theft had been blamed on him and used to inflame settler anger, then these forged contracts would have been presented as legitimate. The territorial government would have used the Apache aggression as justification to enforce them. The tribe would have been removed, their objections dismissed as the complaints of people who'd already proven themselves dangerous and untrustworthy. It was a scheme built on layers of deception, each piece designed to reinforce the others. The stolen rifles created the crime. The framed cowboy created the villain. The fabricated evidence created the appearance of guilt, and all of it together created the chaos necessary to push through illegal land transfers, while everyone was too angry and frightened to look closely at the paperwork. "Who hired you?" Maka demanded. "Give us names, companies, government officials involved. Tell us everything, and perhaps territorial justice will be merciful." But Royce smiled then, a cold, bitter expression that held no humor. "You think territorial justice cares about your land? Your treaties? Your rights? The men I work for own judges and senators. They own the newspapers that will report this story. They own the future, old man, and your future is already decided. I'm just the messenger." It was a confession wrapped in contempt, an admission that he was guilty of everything alleged, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the system would ultimately protect him. That wealth and influence mattered more than law, that power trumped justice, that people like Mahka and his tribe were obstacles to be removed rather than humans to be respected. The warriors wanted immediate action, wanted to deliver the kind of justice their ancestors would have delivered, swift and final. But Mahka raised his hand and the murmuring stopped. He'd learned something through decades of surviving in a world designed to destroy his people. Restraint was often more powerful than retaliation. Documentation was more valuable than vengeance. "We will not kill you," Mahka said to Royce, "though you deserve it for what you attempted. We will not beat you or drive you into the desert. We will do something far more dangerous to your employers." He held up the forged contracts. "We will take you and these documents to the territorial marshal. We will present evidence of fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy to incite violence for profit. We will let the white man's law judge you, and see if it has any integrity left." It was a gamble. Everyone there knew it. The law wasn't always just. Courts weren't always fair, especially when wealthy interests were involved. But it was also strategic. If the tribe dispensed their own justice, it would feed into the narrative Royce had tried to create. If they used the legal system, it forced that system to either uphold its own stated principles or reveal itself as completely corrupt. Either outcome had value. As warriors bound Royce's hands and prepared to transport him to the territorial authorities, Ayanna felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a bone-deep exhaustion that made her legs weak. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will, and now that the immediate crisis was past, the cost of that courage was presenting its bill. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in shallow gasps that she tried to hide. The fear she'd pushed down while testifying was bubbling back up now. Fear of what might have happened if they hadn't believed her. Fear of what might still happen because she'd spoken. Fear of the attention and the responsibility and the weight of having changed the course of events. Mahka approached his daughter. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with too many emotions to name. Pride and fear, gratitude and anger, love and worry about what her courage might cost her in the days ahead. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked finally, his voice rough with suppressed feeling.
3 days, Ayanna.
You carried this knowledge for 3 days, while an innocent man faced death. Why? It was a fair question, one she'd been asking herself constantly. Because I was afraid, she answered honestly. Afraid of not being believed, afraid of causing conflict with the settlers, afraid of what it would mean for our family if I accused a white man and was wrong. Or worse, if I was right but couldn't prove it. She met her father's eyes. I was a coward for 3 days. And then I decided I'd rather face the consequences of speaking than live with the consequences of silence. Maka pulled her into an embrace. Not the formal acknowledgement of a chief to a tribe member, but the desperate hold of a father who'd almost lost his daughter to dangers he couldn't protect her from. You were never a coward, he said quietly. Fear is not cowardice. Acting despite fear, that is courage. And you showed more courage today than most warriors show in a lifetime. But courage had complications. The tribe's women approached Ayana with mixed reactions. Some praised her bravery. Others questioned whether it was appropriate for her to speak in council. A few whispered concerns about what her boldness might mean for other women's place in tribal society. Change. Even good change. Unsettled the patterns people had learned to navigate. One of the elder women, a grandmother named Kiona, who'd survived more hardships than most could imagine, took Ayana's hand. You did something dangerous today, she said quietly. Not just dangerous to Royce Callahan or his plans. Dangerous to the way things have always been. Men don't like being shown they were wrong. They especially don't like being shown they were wrong by women. She paused, her weathered face serious. Some will respect you for this. Some will resent you. And some will try to make sure no other woman thinks she has the right to speak truth the way you did. It was a warning, wrapped in wisdom. A reminder that progress had costs. That breaking one barrier often meant becoming a target for those who wanted to maintain all the others. Ayana understood this intellectually, but feeling it, living it, that would be a different challenge entirely. Jacob Stone approached her once his hands were unbound and his wounds were tended. He stood before her awkwardly, hat in his hands, searching for words that could capture what her testimony had meant. You saved my life, he finally said simply. I know that's not enough, those 3 words, but I don't have better ones. You saved my life by risking your own, and I'll carry that debt until my last breath. Ayana shook her head. It wasn't debt I was thinking about, she said. It was justice. It was truth. It was refusing to let evil win just because speaking up was uncomfortable. She looked at him, this stranger whose fate had become tangled with hers. You don't owe me anything except to remember this. Remember that silence has weight, that watching injustice and doing nothing is its own kind of sin, remember. And maybe someday when you see someone else facing false accusation, you'll find the courage to speak. It was a charge, a responsibility passed from one person to another. The understanding that being saved came with an obligation to save others when opportunity arose. That survival wasn't just about living. It was about what you did with the life you'd been given. The tribal council gathered to discuss what came next. Royce would be taken to the territorial marshal, but there were no guarantees justice would be served. Powerful men protected their interests through powerful networks. The marshal might be honest, or might be bought. The judge might be impartial, or might owe favors to mining companies. The newspapers might report the truth, or might spin a story that served settler interests. We need our own documentation, one elder suggested. Written testimony, signed statements from witnesses, copies of those forged contracts. Evidence so clear that even corrupt officials will have trouble ignoring it. The others nodded. They'd learned through hard experience that oral testimony could be dismissed. Paper, official paper with seals and signatures, that carried weight the legal system couldn't easily ignore. Ayana volunteered to write the testimony. She'd been taught letters by a missionary who'd lived with the tribe briefly before being recalled by his superiors for being too sympathetic to the Apache cause. Her handwriting was clear and careful, and she understood how to structure an account that white authorities would respect. It meant hours of work. detailed recounting of everything she'd witnessed. But she'd already crossed the threshold. There was no safety in retreat now, only forward momentum. As night fell, the tribe prepared a meal to honor the truth that had been spoken and the justice that had been preserved. It wasn't a celebration. Too much uncertainty remained for that. But it was an acknowledgement, a moment to breathe and recognize that they'd survived a threat they hadn't even known existed until it was almost too late. Jacob Stone sat at the edge of the gathering, still processing everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, he'd been preparing to die. Now he was free, his name cleared, his life returned. But freedom came with strange feelings. Guilt that his near execution had revealed a larger conspiracy. Gratitude toward a woman he barely knew. Anger at the system that had made such conspiracies possible. And underneath it all, a gnawing question about what he was supposed to do next. "You're welcome to stay," Maka told him, "at least until we're certain Royce's employers won't try to retaliate. You're safer here than alone on the trail." It was both an invitation and a strategic calculation. Jacob was a witness now. His testimony about being attacked and framed would support the tribe's case. Keeping him alive and protected served everyone's interests. Jacob accepted, though he felt uncomfortable with the idea of sanctuary. He'd spent 3 years running from connection, from obligation, from the messiness of human relationship. And now here he was, bound to these people through circumstance and shared danger, connected whether he wanted to be or not. Ayana found him later that evening staring up at the stars. She brought him coffee, strong and bitter, the way frontier people drank it when they needed to stay alert. "You're thinking about leaving," she observed. Not a question. A statement. "I always leave," Jacob said. "It's what I do." Stay too long in one place, and you start to put down roots. Roots make you vulnerable. They give the world something to tear away from you. Ayana sat beside him. "That's not wisdom," she said gently. "That's fear wearing wisdom's clothing. You're not protecting yourself by staying isolated. You're just making sure you're alone when something terrible happens. And terrible things happen whether you're connected to people or not. The only question is whether you face them surrounded by support or surrounded by nothing but your own fear." It was the kind of insight that struck deeper than comfortable. Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to defend his choices, but the events of the past few days had stripped away his ability to maintain convenient lies. He'd been saved by connection, by a stranger's courage, by a community that chose justice over expedience. His isolation hadn't protected him. It had nearly gotten him killed. "I don't know how to be the kind of person who stays," he admitted finally. "I don't know how to trust that tomorrow won't take away everything I care about. I've lost too much, watched too many people die or leave or betray. Solitude is simpler. It hurts less." Ayana nodded slowly. "It hurts less," she agreed. "But it also means less. Living small to avoid large pain, that's survival, not life. And you seem like someone who deserves more than just survival." She stood, preparing to return to her work on the testimony. "You don't have to decide tonight. But think about this. You almost died for something you didn't do. Maybe that's the universe telling you it's time to start living for something you choose." She left him there with his coffee and his thoughts, and the vast desert sky stretched above like a blanket sewn from darkness and distant fire. 3 days later, a small group left the tribal camp for the territorial marshal's office. Maka led them, carrying the forged contracts and carefully documented testimony. 2 warriors accompanied him, along with Ayana and Jacob Stone. Royce Callahan rode with his hands bound, his expressions sullen and calculating. He hadn't stopped looking for opportunities to escape, but the warriors were careful, and the opportunities never came. The ride took most of a day, through canyon country, where the red rock walls held secrets older than memory, past settlement outposts where white faces watched their passage with suspicion and poorly concealed hostility, into the territorial town where the marshal's office stood beside the courthouse and the jail, symbols of civilization's promise to replace violence with law. Marshal Thomas Reed was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough of frontier justice to be skeptical of everyone's motives. When Marker's group arrived with their prisoner and their evidence, Reed's first instinct was suspicion. Apache bringing charges against a white man? That usually ended badly for everyone involved. But he'd also heard rumors about land fraud schemes, and the forged contracts got his attention fast. He read through the documents carefully, listened to Ayana's testimony with the careful attention of someone trained to spot lies, examined the physical evidence, the canvas fibers, the receipt, the surveying tools that had no connection to legitimate surveying work. And slowly, reluctantly, his expression shifted from skepticism to anger. "If this is accurate," Reed said finally, "we're looking at conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted murder, and incitement to violence. Federal crimes, some of them. This goes beyond my jurisdiction." He looked at Royce. "Who hired you? Give me names, and I'll recommend leniency to the territorial judge." But Royce had regained some of his confidence in the familiar territory of white civilization. "I want a lawyer," he said flatly. "I'm not saying anything without legal representation. And I think we all know how this plays out. My word against theirs? A surveyor against a tribe with every reason to lie. What jury is going to believe the Apache over a white professional? It was a calculated gamble based on bitter truth. Juries in territorial courts were drawn from settler populations. Populations who often had financial interests in seeing tribal lands opened for development. Populations who'd been fed stories about savage Indians and civilized progress. The system was rigged, and Royce knew it. Marshal Reed's jaw tightened. He was an honest man, trying to enforce law in a system that often protected the guilty and condemned the innocent based on nothing more than race and economics. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "And maybe a jury won't convict you. But they'll see this evidence. They'll hear this testimony. And even if you walk free, even if your employers protect you, everyone will know. The newspapers will report it. Other tribes will be warned. And the next time someone tries a scheme like this, people will be watching for it. It wasn't the justice Marker's tribe deserved, but it was something. Documentation. Official record. Seeds planted that might bloom into accountability later, even if immediate consequences never came. Sometimes that was all you could hope for. That truth spoken loudly enough would echo into the future and make the next crime harder to commit. The marshal agreed to hold Royce for trial and forward the evidence to territorial and federal prosecutors. He couldn't guarantee outcomes, but he could guarantee process. And process, however flawed, was better than the alternative of watching crimes disappear into comfortable silence. Before leaving town, Maka made one more stop, the newspaper office, a small operation run by an editor named Samuel Wright, who'd come west to escape his past and had discovered that the frontier was where people created futures built on lies and violence. Wright was cynical but not corrupt, jaded but not blind. When Maka presented him with copies of the testimony and evidence, Wright's eyes lit up with the hunger of someone who'd finally found a story worth the ink. "You understand, this won't make me popular," Wright said as he reviewed the documents. "Mining companies buy advertisements. Settlement corporations have influential friends. Publishing this could put me out of business. Or it could make you the man who exposed the greatest land fraud scheme in territorial history," Maka countered. "The man who proved that truth still matters more than profit. Your choice what kind of legacy you leave," Wright smiled grimly. "You're appealing to my better angels, and they're weak from disuse, but damn it, yes, I'll run the story. Front page. Full details. Let the chips fall where they may. At least when I'm run out of town, I'll be able to look myself in the mirror." The story ran 3 days later. It spread through the territory like fire through dry grass. Some dismissed it as Apache propaganda. Some claimed Wright had been bribed or fooled. But others read the evidence and saw the pattern. Saw how close an entire tribe had come to being legally robbed through manufactured crisis and forged documents. And they started asking questions about other land transfers, other treaties, Other times when convenient violence had preceded lucrative contracts. It didn't stop the land grabs, didn't end the corruption, but it made the next scheme harder, made the perpetrators more careful, made some officials think twice before approving documents that couldn't survive scrutiny. Change came slowly in the territories, but it came. And it came because people like Ayanna and Maka and Jacob, Stone and Samuel Wright chose to speak truth when silence would have been easier and safer. Jacob Stone left the tribal camp 2 weeks after the trial began, not fleeing this time, but departing with purpose. He'd made a decision during those quiet desert nights. He was done running from connection, done pretending that isolation was strength. He was going to find work in a settlement near the tribal lands, close enough to check in occasionally, close enough to stand witness if trouble came again. Before he left, Ayanna gave him provisions for the journey, dried meat and water and bread she'd made herself, and tucked among the supplies was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a bracelet woven from leather and beads, traditional Apache work that carried meaning in every pattern. "It means protector," she explained, "not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of standing watch, of refusing to look away, of being the person who speaks when others are silent." She smiled. It seemed appropriate for someone whose life was saved by speaking, and who maybe learned something about the power of his own voice. Jacob accepted it with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming recognition that he'd been given something precious. Not just a gift, but a belonging, a place in a story larger than his own survival, a role that mattered. He left at dawn, riding into the desert with the bracelet on his wrist and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Behind him, the tribal camp continued its daily rhythms. Children played, women worked, men hunted and prepared. Life went on because life always went on. But it went on differently now. Changed by what had happened, changed by what had been spoken and what had been stopped. Ayanna stood watching him go until he disappeared into the wavering heat lines on the horizon. She felt different too, not weaker for having been vulnerable, but stronger for having survived her own courage. She'd learned something essential about power, that it didn't always come from physical strength or official authority. Sometimes it came from simply refusing to accept lies, from speaking truth even when your voice shook, from being willing to stand up when sitting down would have been more comfortable. Her father joined her at the edge of camp. They stood together in silence, watching the empty desert where Jacob had disappeared. "You changed things," Maka said quietly. "Not just for him, for all of us. The women are talking about speaking more in council meetings, about being heard on matters that affect the tribe's future. You opened a door that will be hard to close." "Good," Ayanna said simply. "Doors that are hard to close are the ones most worth opening." She looked at her father. "I know it makes things complicated. I know it disrupts the way things have always been. But the way things have always been, that's gotten us treaties that break and promises that crumble. Maybe it's time we tried something different. Maybe it's time we remembered that truth isn't determined by who has the right to speak, but by what's actually true." Maka nodded slowly. He was old enough to fear change and wise enough to recognize its necessity. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "She always said you had her fire. I used to worry that fire would burn you. Now I understand. Fire isn't what destroys you. It's what lets you see in the darkness. And these are dark times that need light." Months passed. Royce Callahan was convicted on some charges and acquitted on others. The sentences were lighter than justice demanded, but heavier than cynics expected. The mining companies denied knowledge of his schemes. The forged contracts were declared invalid. The tribal lands remained, for now, protected by treaties that had been tested and had held. But more importantly, the story held. It spread through other tribes and settlements. It became a warning and an example. It showed that schemes could be exposed, that the powerful could be challenged, that one voice speaking 4 words at the right moment could shatter elaborate lies and redirect the course of events. "I saw you do it." 4 words, simple and direct and devastating. 4 words that carried the weight of witnessed truth. 4 words that reminded everyone who heard the story that courage didn't require physical strength or official authority. It just required the willingness to speak, to stand, to refuse complicity in evil through convenient silence. And in the years that followed, when other young people faced moments of choice, moments when speaking up felt dangerous and staying quiet felt safe, some of them remembered Ayana's story, remembered that change began with individual acts of courage, that justice wasn't something handed down from distant authorities. It was something you fought for in the moment when fighting mattered most. The desert kept its secrets and its stories. The Red Rock stood witness to countless moments of courage and cowardice, justice and injustice, truth and lies. But some stories echoed. Some stories became the kind of legends that shaped how people understood what was possible, what was right, what was worth risking everything to protect. Ayana grew older, became a healer and a teacher, married and raised children who heard the story of the 4 words so many times they could recite it in their sleep. And when her grandchildren asked if she'd been afraid that day when she stood before the council, she always told them the truth. "I was terrified," she'd say. "My hands shook. My voice shook. Everything shook." But fear isn't failure. Fear is just the price courage charges for admission. And some moments are worth paying that price. Because the cost of silence, the cost of watching injustice triumph while you stay safe, and that's a price that compounds over time until you can't afford your own reflection in the mirror. And the children would nod with the solemn understanding of those learning lessons they'd need someday. Learning that heroes weren't fearless. They were just afraid in the service of something larger than self-preservation. Learning that justice wasn't inevitable. It was something people created through choice and action, and the willingness to speak truth into spaces designed to suppress it. The story of the 4 words lived on, passed from generation to generation, changed in small ways, with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. That one voice mattered, that speaking up was worth the risk, that lies could seem invincible right up until the moment someone refused to honor their power. And somewhere in the vast territories of the American frontier, in the space between the myths we tell and the realities we survive, that story became more than just an account of what happened. It became a reminder of what was possible when courage met necessity at the crossroads of history. 4 words. I saw you do it. Simple enough for a child to understand. Powerful enough to change the course of justice. Spoken by a woman who chose truth over comfort, and in doing so reminded everyone who heard about the extraordinary power of ordinary courage. The desert sun set. The stars emerged. The frontier continued its slow transformation from wilderness to civilization, and the echo of those 4 words rippled forward into time. A reminder that every generation faces its own moments of choice. Its own chances to speak or stay silent, its own opportunities to decide whether justice is something worth fighting for or just a pretty word we use when it's convenient. The answer, the real answer, was written in moments like these, in the courage of individuals who refused to let evil hide behind plausible lies, in the strength of communities that chose principle over expedience, in the persistence of people who understood that the long arc of history doesn't bend toward justice by itself. It bends because people grab hold and pull with everything they have. And sometimes all it takes is 4 words spoken at exactly the right moment by someone who refuses to be silent when silence serves evil. 4 words that shattered lies. 4 words that saved lives. 4 words that changed everything. I saw you do it. And as the sun sets on this story, if you felt something here, hit that like button and subscribe for more Western tales just like this. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far these stories travel, and don't ride off just yet. Check out these other cool videos waiting for you on the trail. Until next time, keep your boots steady and your heart honest.